in that same front page below the fold. The merger of St. Luke's, I guess it isn't below the fold, of St. Luke's and Beth Israel Hospital in New York.
It is.
Again, this is more of a trend story than a big news story, but it's an example of how since 1993, amazingly enough, coinciding with the defeat of the so-called Clinton reform, that American medicine through the marketplace has completely reinvented itself. Now, a lot of the reinvention has been experimental and innovative, and there have been a lot of disappointments and failures along the way. But in fact, exactly the problem that President Clinton campaigned in 1992 on, and saying that only government could solve, that is, the rise in medical costs and the shrinkage of the number of people covered by private health insurance, is in its sort of crude, lumbering, often brutal way being directly handled by the American marketplace. That costs have come down. The rate of medical inflation has fallen to below 4% over the past 3 years. Americans are switching from traditional medicine to HMOs. As a result, the number of people who are losing their coverage is being stabilized. And stories like this are just sort of give us periodic glimpses of a marketplace that is being reinvented in a creative way. And it warns us that just as we now see that the 1993 Clinton health plan would have aborted a lot of these important changes, that we have to be very wary of what the president plans in his second term. He again plans to monkey, this time in a more cynical and opportunistic and less coherent way than in the first term with the American healthcare marketplace. And again, this should be stopped. There are always going to be horror stories when you have a marketplace that is churning and reinventing itself as rapidly as this one. But on the whole, this is a story of tremendous creativity and dynamism, and it should not be interfered with.
Any thoughts?
You're Canadian, aren't you? Are you a refugee from the single payer? Do you consider yourself to be?
The summary line on the Canadian health care system is Canada is a great place to be when you're not sick. That if you twist your ankle, I'd much rather twist my ankle in Toronto than in Washington. I go to a hospital, the doctor looks at me, I come out again, no paperwork, no forms to fill out. If, however, I'm sick, if I need an MRI, if I need a CAT scan, if I need a world-level surgeon, I would much rather be in the United States than in Canada. That for all its bureaucracy and inefficiencies and inconveniences, the American system does do a better job of providing high technological medicine than the Canadian. There are more, I think there are more CAT scan machines in metropolitan Washington than in all of Canada.
Well, the United States is a richer country too, but I mean, as someone who was brought up in... I can't believe that one couldn't close the technical gap without compromising the principle of healthcare. I mean, I think it's just extraordinary that this country and South Africa are the only countries that can be described as advanced, which don't have a national health provision of some kind or another. And my experiences with it here seem to have persuaded me, at any rate. They combine the worst of capitalism with the worst of socialism. I mean, you can turn up, and if you haven't got a Visa card on you, they'll send you away. But the amount of paperwork and bureaucracy and paper shuffling and duplication of work that's involved in doing it is absolutely terrifying and would disgrace a Stalinist banana republic. And yet it's all for profit.
How's that compared to England, by the way?
Britain has a national health. Health treatment is a right in Britain. And it's the one thing of the one aspect, one achievement, I should better say, of the post-war Labour government that not even Mrs. Thatcher dared to touch.
I don't know about the British situation. The way I would compare the United States and Canada is in Canada, we have these immense queues for all kinds of important operations. Everyone has insurance in Canada, but not everybody gets care. In the United States, it turns out almost everybody gets care, although many people lack insurance. So there's a choice. I won't defend the American system. It's obviously, it does combine the worst of both. It's also, by the way, a system in which the government looms very large. That's the cause of a lot of the problems. The federal government is the single largest purchaser of health care in the United States. But as this story shows, the private market has tremendous creative potential in the United States, and it should be let free.
Well, the private market certainly knows how to do mergers, but I felt I knew that already.
About a half hour left with David Frum and Chris Hitchens. Aurora, Illinois, you've been hanging on. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Hitchens. Two quick questions, then my point. Can you give me your opinion of the De Leon-inspired Socialist Labor Party? Number two, you recall earlier in the year the SEC investigated the NASDAQ market makers for corruption. I was hoping you or your friend over at Counterpoint, Alexander Comer, could look into the market makers equivalent on the New York Stock Exchange, the specialists. I've heard they are deeply corrupt and have massive conflicts of interest. Now, There's a wonderful article in the newest edition of the Progressive magazine by Elaine Rapping called Burrowing Within that addresses the cult of individualism. I spoke with you once and suggested that far more of a threat than the religious right is the Ayn Rand-inspired libertarian right. What makes them so insidious is that under the guise of self-help and therapy, they spread their deeply ideological pro-corporate message consisting chiefly of the lie that life is what you make it, when anyone who's ever had a Walmart or McDonald's come to town or worked inside these fascist multinationals knows the opposite is true, that life under capitalism is what corporations make it. And Mr. Frum, I would have to say that the government of China is about as communist as Pat Robertson is a Christian. Thank you.
It's a lot out there. Go ahead and react.
There's a very high standard of call for this time of the morning. I mean, not, but it's, I think it's the opening bit is a little arcane for some people. Daniel De Leon was a great American socialist, rather dogmatic, rather schematic, thought by some, who ran for president on the Socialist Labour ticket, and founded a party which still bears that name, which still produces a socialist weekly called, I believe, The People. James Connolly, the great Irish Republican socialist revolutionary who was murdered by the British after the Easter Rising, got his early training in Daniel De Leon's party. Let me see. On the NASDAQ, I'll have to pass. I'm sorry, I just don't know enough about the SEC and NASDAQ, and I missed that story. As for what you ask about Ayn Rand and her influence on the American right, I think it's extremely interesting. There is a strain of, I'm sure a lot of people watching this have read either Atlas Shrugged or The Fountainhead, and perhaps imbibed some of the Randian doctrine, which is best summarized, I think, in her book, The Virtue of Selfishness. I've always thought it quaint and rather touching that there is in America a movement that thinks that people are not yet selfish enough. And I've met some of its supporters. They call themselves objectivists. And I've debated with them, but I've never got to the bottom of that problem. They think that really America is a society already rotten with too much socialism and compassion. And it's just so refreshing to meet people who manage to get through their day actually believing that.
The discussion here is getting very broad in terms of issues. What do you folks look for when you pick up the paper in the morning?
What do I look for?
Yeah.
I look for the style section, actually. It's always kind of a fight to get hold of it. I'm ashamed to admit that.
No, I became a journalist because I didn't want to have to rely on the newspapers for information. And I can't imagine what it's like for people who only do get their information that way. I mean, I get all my information, I think, from talking to other people in Washington. I read it basically for entertainment. And I follow the op-ed pages pretty closely, too.
The reason I asked the question is because there's a story about what's hot on the radio. We covered an event by Talkers Magazine yesterday. I wanted to compare your top 10 to this top 10. These are what radio talk show hosts say are the 10 hottest topics. We'll go right down the list and have you add or subtract from your own list. Presidential and local elections, quote, scandal gates of several varieties, crash of TWA Flight 800, Olympic bombing, the Value Jet crash, Unabomber, life on Mars, the Army sex scandal, the O.J. Simpson trial, and Texaco's racial problems. Whoops. Compare and contrast there to your list in terms of interest.
A half a dozen of them, or about half of them, I can't imagine what there is. I can't imagine what there is to say about the Value Jet crash, for example, that would fill up time on the radio. That it's a terrible thing. But I think that unless it's part of some kind of conspiracy worldview, like as I think has happened to the TWA.
No, surely it's to do with the fact that people on the staff of Value Jet were warning us before this crash that there were terrible corners being cut. Wouldn't that be the thing?
Well, I don't know what I don't know what the
corners being cut. I mean, maintenance corners being cut.
Yeah, I don't know if that's exactly why it is that this is so exciting to the people on talk radio.
I would move life on Mars much higher up the list.
Number one? Not quite?
Well, over some local elections I would. Yeah, actually, no, I think it's up. I read a book once by a man I do look for in the paper is John Noble Wilford, the science writer of the Times, the New York Times, who wrote a wonderful book called Mars Beckons about the possibility, not that there is life on Mars, but that life could be created there, that the conditions for it exist, and that by seeding Mars, do I look like a complete crackpot when I'm saying this? That by seeding Mars with nitrous oxide and so on, you could create clouds which would one day create rain, which would one day create life. This is a real possibility, apparently. Absolutely enthralling work. that one could organize